Hi, my name is Claire Charamnac, and I am the co-founder of Women Lead, the first and only leadership development organization for young women in Kathmandu, Nepal. I'm also on the board of the Red Thread Foundation, which is a foundation that provides scholarships for immigrant women who are going to university in the United States. I'm really pleased to be on the Change Summit. Thank you so much to Grace and Salonia for this opportunity, and I look forward to diving into some of these questions and talking a little bit about my TCK experience. So, this theme of the global citizen is something that I think is super important, both in my industry and international development, and also as a theme right now, because of the fact that we obviously are seeing a leadership crisis, I think, in different countries. I think you can say that applies around the world. And a lot of the problems we're seeing, whether it's global poverty, whether it's debt, are linked a lot to the leaders that we have. And I truly believe that ethical and qualified leaders need to be global citizens as well. They need to be aware of the issues that are happening, not just in their community or nation, but what's happening around the world and how it impacts their country. So I guess in response to the first question, which is whether I consider myself a TCK and what it means to me, I definitely consider myself a TCK. So I was born in Venezuela. I grew up in Singapore, and my dad is French and my mom is Filipina. So I would say I'm more than a third culture kid, probably 4, 5, 6 cultures. I live in the United States. I've lived in the United States for the past 7 years now. And so there's a lot of different cultures happening at the same time. And I wouldn't identify with any one culture. I definitely have always said that Singapore is my home and it'll always be my home. But I don't, I know I'm not Singaporean and I don't feel Singaporean, but it wouldn't be enough to sort of limit it to one nationality. And so when I talk about my background, I do come back to all those different elements because they all make up who I am. I mean, I think being an expat is really tied into that idea. So both good and problematic that you have with being an expat. I think that notion of feeling a little bit different, a little bit outside what the culture is definitely something that I grew up with. Something actually that being in the United States, I've been able to slide a little bit more under the radar because of my accent. Which I've always had. I've had this accent when I grew up in Singapore, and so I get mistaken for being American. And when I'm in the U.S., people just assume I'm American, don't really ask any questions about that or being a third culture kid. But at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that I'm not an American citizen. When election debates happen, I'm not ultimately voting for this candidate. And the weird thing about being a third culture kid is that, I know a lot more about American politics than I do about Filipino politics or about French politics. And so always a little bit alarming considering that I vote in the French elections. But what I feel tied to, for example, what makes me French is having grown up going to French school in Singapore, speaking French, having a French family, cheering on the French sports team. But I almost define, I think, what being French is for myself. It's not what other people would think being French is, because I don't seem French. I don't sound like a French person. I don't talk like a French person. And I would say French people probably think that I'm not very French in my outlook. But fundamentally, it's something that I'm very tied to, but it's something I had to define for myself. So not only defining what third culture kid means, but what it means to be a certain nationality when most people in that nationality aren't like you. So it's a little bit of that sense of being from everywhere and being from nowhere. But I do think when you are an expat or a third culture kid and you end up in different locations, you actually do have to tie on to an identity, even if you don't feel as strongly about it. So, having to prove that I'm French or that when I am, whether it is in France or in other countries, has made that stronger. I think in terms of the second question of, is being a TCK the same as being a global citizen? I don't think it is. I think it's being a TCK is you're born being a TCK. You have the privilege or the burden or however you think it is to be a TCK. However, being a global citizen means you're acting on what I think is a privilege, right? Of having being able to grow up in different countries and see the world and all these other things, it means you need to take action on that. Because it's not just great to be traveling and seeing other cultures and coming back and that's it. Is, well, now that you've interacted with all these different cultures, what have you learned from that? And what do you take from that? And what are the things that you're passionate about that you want to change, or you want to have a hand in changing? So I think it is always thinking of acting globally versus acting locally. I mean, I guess I do have sort of a bias towards acting globally. I don't just see issues as ever being local. I mean, they're always tied, and it's hard for me to even define what local is, because I, will live in one community for a couple of years and live in another community for a couple of years. And I think, so the question that comes up occasionally, especially in the work that I do, international development, comes up, why would you spend money abroad when there are problems at home? I think that's something sometimes Americans would bring up. And that's never something that it is a dilemma for me. I think being a third culture kid, I don't feel like one culture or one tie that I have is more important than the other. So my work that I do, I work with girls, as I mentioned, to help empower them to become leaders in their schools and their communities in Nepal. I have no tie to Nepal. I mean, I was very fortunate to meet my co-founder, and she grew up in Nepal. She's another third culture kid, actually. I had no ties, but that doesn't mean I wasn't passionate about it, didn't want to work on that with her in Nepal. And that didn't make it, just because I'm half Filipino doesn't mean, I should have worked in the Philippines, or that would be more important than me working in Nepal. I think when you care about something, and for me, it's caring about women's empowerment, it doesn't really matter where it is. It's an issue everywhere. And then, nationality doesn't really matter. Even though I do ask myself that question a lot, like, should I be going back to the Philippines and working in the Philippines, for example? But I think it's no matter where your passion really, really brings you. So, in terms of the other question is, then what is then the role of TCKs as citizens of the world? I think, we have a responsibility to celebrate different viewpoints. And I think that's very hard when you get stuck in one thing, because you even get a TCK viewpoint, or you get an expat viewpoint, which is only people who've traveled know what they're talking about. And I think that's a dangerous viewpoint. I think you can not have traveled, but have traveled through reading books and through being just curious. I think being curious is an important personality trait. I don't think you need to travel to have that. But it's kind of, the onus is on us to say, celebrate differences, not just tolerate, not just accept, celebrate. And how do we, as these cross-cultural people with that knowledge that we have, how do we bring people together from different walks of life? How do we break down stereotypes? How do we bring people together who normally wouldn't be in the same room? So I think that's being more conscious about, if I'm in a conversation about something, how can I bring in a viewpoint from, Singapore, the East? How can I bring something, and I'm not maybe as good as that, because it's always hard to bring all of your identities together. But I think it's just trying to put in some viewpoints that aren't normally there. And as I said, it's incredibly hard being open-minded and being, with people who are very different from you, staying open to their point. You don't have to agree with their point, but staying open to it and seeing what you can learn from it. I think we get really, really tied to our beliefs. How do we cultivate a global citizen mindset? I think I mentioned it. I mean, if you have the privilege of being able to travel, then obviously take it, right? And I think there's much to learn from that. But I think more of it is choosing to be around people who are, as I mentioned, curious, who read a lot, who question things a lot, who give you different viewpoints, and who force you to not stay stuck to your side of the story, to your one truth. They force you to question a little bit what you always assumed. I think that's one way of really becoming a global citizen. And I think the one piece of advice I would give to TCKs trying to establish their identity, embrace the contradictions, because there will always be contradictions. I don't look Asian, but I am Asian. I don't sound French, but I am French. I sound American, but I'm not American. So none of these things come together, but it's my own identity that I've created, and it doesn't, I don't get confused by that. My identity is all those different things put together, and then me choosing to interpret it the way that I want to interpret it. And so I think it's, if you're a TCK or global citizen, not getting caught up on, what am I supposed to be defined by? What does my nationality mean that I'm supposed to be, or that I'm from, or the way I'm supposed to act? And I guess it's more than one piece of advice for establishing your identity, but I think it's so linked to passion. You're given this opportunity. I think it's very hard I think for TCKs, it almost comes naturally to, how does having this global perspective, how do you take it from, again, TCK to global citizen? How do you take it from, this is something that I am, to this is something that I do? And whether you do it as an everyday interaction, whether you just do it with your friends, whether you do it as a career, how do you bring those cross-cultural skills and knowledge to the table, and to change the conversation a little bit?